Earlier we considered the English auction, which was an ascending price auction where the highest bidder ended up winning. A different kind of auction is a descending price Dutch auction. Again, the one who makes the highest bid is going to win, but this is structured in a different way. So this auction begins with a high price, and that high price is set at a level where it's expected that nobody is going to bid at that high price. The price is then lowered until somebody makes a bid. And when that bid is made, the auction is over, and that bidder automatically wins the auction and gets whatever's being sold. The picture here shows a famous Dutch auction which takes place in the Netherlands, and it involves the sale of flowers. So up at the front of the picture are large quantities of flowers which are moving continually across the floor as these bidders who are seated in the auditorium look on. And of course they would have had a chance to examine the flowers earlier. What appears up on the big screens here are a description of exactly which selection of flowers is available, and there's also, although we can't see it clearly here, there's also a big clock on there which starts at the high price and moves rapidly down to lower prices. So the individuals seated here, if they want to bid, have to press a button indicating their bid, stopping the clock and making their bid. This kind of auction is useful for selling large quantities of things because the auction is over fairly quickly. In this case, just a few seconds, and we're on to the next lot of flowers. One feature of this kind of auction, unlike the English auction where you see the bids of different people as the bidding takes place, here only one bid happens, so there's no information revealed at all about what other people might have been willing to bid. Well, this raises the question, what should the strategy of a bidder be in such an auction? Let's think about that. One way to think about it is to imagine that you are the person with the highest valuation. Let's call that V. Of course, if you don't have the highest valuation, then whatever strategy you're following isn't really going to matter because someone else is going to outbid you and win the auction. So let's suppose that you're the person in the room with the highest valuation. You might also suppose that there's a lowest possible valuation, which I call L. Maybe that's the reserve price that the seller has set, so you know that it's not going to be sold below that. Or perhaps that's just your estimate of the lowest possible valuation that other people could have for this object. Well, how much should you bid? Clearly, you'd like to get some surplus. And you might expect that, of course, there's going to be somebody with a valuation less than yours. Let's call it B. But you don't know what that valuation is going to be. If you wait around and decide to make a bid which is less than your valuation, somebody might just hop in and bid and take the object away from you, despite the fact that you would have been actually willing to pay more. Of course, there is some temptation to wait because if you wait a little bit, you can get some surplus. We'll call it consumer surplus. So there's a trade-off between bidding sooner and being more sure that you're going to win the auction, and waiting longer, risking that somebody else is going to bid, but at the same time getting a chance of a greater surplus. So what should your bid be? Let's consider a specific example. Suppose that your valuation is 100 and you think that the lowest possible valuation of the other bidders is 80. And suppose that you also know the number of bidders in the room who are going to be potentially bidding on this object. If you just suppose that people's valuations are evenly distributed between 180, then the average difference between each valuation would be about $2. So if your valuation is 100, then you might suppose that a good guess of the next person's valuation would be $2 less than yours. So you might think that you could make a bid of just slightly over $98. In that way, that would maximize the amount of your surplus. In this case, only $2, not terribly exciting, but that would be the maximum surplus that you could get. But of course, as I said before, there's a risk that, in fact, the other person's valuation is going to be not $98, but maybe $99. And so if you wait to bid just slightly over $98, that other person could bid and win the auction. And then you wouldn't get any surplus at all. So what should you do? Well, the answer depends on how much risk you want to take. If you're risk averse, if you don't like risk, then you would be inclined to bid something that was close to $100. You wouldn't want to risk losing the auction entirely and losing any surplus that you might have otherwise got. On the other hand, if you didn't really worry about risk, if you were what is called risk neutral, then if $98 is your best estimate of the other valuation, you might be willing to bet or to bid just slightly over $98. So it turns out that the best strategy in this Dutch auction really depends on how the bidder feels about risk. The more risk the person wants to take, the lower is the bid that the person with the highest valuation is going to make. In this case, the bid would be closer to $98. If the bidders are risk averse, maybe very risk averse, then they will bid a higher price. Let's consider how this outcome in the Dutch auction compares to the English auction. We saw that in the English auction, let's suppose the second highest valuation really was $98. In the English auction, the outcome would be that the bidding would go on and somebody might bid $98 and the auction would be settled at that because nobody else has a higher valuation. So the winner of the auction effectively pays the second highest valuation. possibly plus a little increment, as we saw in the examples of the English auction. So that was a situation where we could predict that the outcome of the auction was going to be that the person with the highest valuation effectively paid a price that was the second highest valuation, again perhaps plus a little bit. Now we've seen in the Dutch auction that we could have something very similar happen. If the person didn't care about risk, if the bidder didn't care about risk, then that person would bid, in this case, say $98 plus a little bit. The result would be the same as the English auction. The two would have the same expected revenue from the point of view of the seller. On the other hand, we saw that risk aversion came into play here. So if the bidders are risk averse, then the person with the highest valuation is likely to bid a bit more than the price would be if this was being sold in an English auction. Because instead of, say, bidding $98 plus a little bit, perhaps the person would bid $99.50 or something like that, a higher price. So we could conclude that if the bidders are risk averse, a Dutch auction might bring in a little bit more revenue than an English auction would. I'll summarize these conclusions about revenue in a slide at the end. Let's briefly consider another auction that's rather similar to the Dutch auction. This is what's called the first price sealed bid auction. So when we have a sealed bid auction, it's effectively the same as if everybody is making their bids at the same time. And because it's a sealed bid auction, in other words, the bids are, say, sealed in an envelope and are kept secret from the other bidders, nobody knows the valuations that other participants have. One version of this auction is that the highest bid wins and the winner pays that price. Well, that sounds very similar to the Dutch auction, where there's just one bid and the highest bidder is going to pay the price at which they bid. If the object that's being sold has a common value, then clearly the danger of the winner's curse is here again. And so in that situation, bidders need to bid appropriately and adjust their bids downwards. Well, because this is really just very much like the story of the Dutch auction, it's really just one in which there's just a single bid that really counts. The strategy that should be adopted by bidders is exactly the same as the Dutch auction. There's one variation in this auction that I will talk about in a little bit more detail later. It's called a reverse auction. That is, you can imagine companies that are bidding for a contract. They would be bidding to see who offers the lowest price. And so it's the lowest bid that's going to win. So if we had a first price sealed bid auction that was a reverse auction, then whoever bid the lowest price is automatically going to win. There's a winner's curse danger there as well. If the cost of offering the good or the service that's to be provided differs, then somebody who offers the lowest price could end up actually making a loss on the overall transaction. I'll just briefly consider an example of a first price sealed bid auction. It turns out that Air Canada sells seat upgrades on its flights. So 72 hours before a flight, the passengers have the option of putting in a bid, paying a little bit more money, and getting a chance to upgrade their seat, maybe from economy to premium economy or business class. The information that bidders are given is very sparse. The airline won't tell you how many upgrades are available, how many other bidders there are, nothing. So people simply make their bids. The software, however, does give some information that looks like what I've illustrated on the right here, but I don't really know what that means. The airline obviously would like to get you to pay more rather than less, so I don't know really why it would pretend to help you judge whether you're likely to win or not. In this particular case, the airline, which is selling the upgrades, has a big advantage because it can manipulate the number of seats that it's actually going to sell. So just before the flight, it gets to see how many people have actually paid high prices, let's say for premium economy and business class, and then it knows how much it's got left over, and it can then auction off those remaining seats for the highest price. So this is yet another strategy of revenue management that airlines have come up with.